Cool. I guess it everything works already, so let me start. My name is Wojtek Erbetowski. I'm glad to see you. I hope you like the conference. We're more or less halfway there already. First things first, I'll try to keep on this side of the scene. Why am I here? I'm a polyglot. I'm a developer using multiple different languages, which pretty much means I'm unfaithful if it comes to technology. I'm trying different languages, a lot of different frameworks, tools, and solutions, although also programming paradigms. I used to be very involved in building the community, mostly in Warsaw, but I've spent a vast amount of my career programming Java, and I have led Warsaw Java user group and a big Java conference in Warsaw as well. Since two of my kids were born, I actually switched, limited down just to maybe sharing my knowledge. But I also like to have a lot of different other changes, and I have been to plenty of companies, plenty of different teams, and work with a variety of projects. I'm sharing that so you can see my context and see what kind of knowledge do I have today to share with you. Currently, I'm a CTO at Codility since like 2 months, so that's pretty fresh, and a trainer at Bottega. And what are those? Codility, I wonder, I was really hoping that you can show me who knows this company or the product. Okay, more or less half. So Codility is aimed for testing developers in the hiring process. So this is very cool. This is the first time for me that I actually build a product for developers. The developers are my users. And you can see a screenshot from a live session that you can have a remote session with the candidate just like that. But on the second part, it's Bottega. You might have seen this slide already. Plenty of speakers in Java world are training with this company. So if you liked some of the talks and you would like to get a trainer to your company, actually check out Bottega IT Minds. Cool. So I'm here to speak about documentation, and documentation is really wide as a topic, right? It might mean either comments in your code, simple explanations, or helps. It might mean documenting APIs or code APIs, interfaces, or even RESTful HTTP APIs as well. So this presentation, I tried to gather the most important lessons I had, but they will come from different parts of documenting our projects and code. So first of all, this is how I started documenting, and this is what we meet and most often mean by documentation. What we do, we explain the code with text. What do I mean by that? Let's have an example. Maybe not here in Devoxx, but actually a lot of community around programming, a lot of people who create code, or scientists who do not call themselves programmers, but they have to code to model, to support their daily work. It's not super often that they use actually Java for that, but it also happens a lot. So you can see a simple model from implementing Newton's gravity right here. Whenever you need to symbolize that or present that, that small piece of code will represent it. So whenever people actually create something like that, it might not be obvious what happens here, right? You have this, you can see in this code, you have more like 3 parts. You declare something, then you have this if, so probably a bigger branch in that code. So maybe one of two things is happening, and then building something to be returned. So when you want to help your colleagues, when you want to make their lives easier, what you do is you add some comments. This code actually comes from Stack Overflow question. I wanted to keep it real-life example. So you can actually see several comments that maybe help you out. So you can see there's a variable called distance, but it tells what distance it is, what the author meant, actually. So the author uses comments to explain this code, to make it more clear what happens here. And this is very useful, and this is very helpful for other developers, but there is a variety of problems that text comments bring into your code. And most of all, comments like that are very fragile. They tend to break, they tend to be out of date. They are fragile whenever you refactor your application. When you try to rename a method, extract or inline a method, move a variable from one place to another, your IDE or your rich text editor may actually help you with that, but it will not fix your comments that were around this part of code. So whenever I want to rename a method or a field, it can be renamed in all of the places in my project, but IDE won't visit the comments right there to see whether they are still accurate. So what happens, usually you end up with this inaccurate or even lying comment. Going back to this example, what you can do differently is you can actually treat code as something that can explain itself. Instead of adding text, pure plain text to your code, you can actually modify this code a little bit to make it easier to understand what's going on right here. So there aren't many changes, but I have actually renamed this variable. It had one comment saying what it is, so let's name it. It's actually target to earth distance. No further comments needed here. If I had an if, and you had to read it or read the comment to understand why is it differently, I have extracted two private methods to cover this functionality. But method is something very different than a block of code, because method has its name. So you can, in this part, you can actually read. So whenever target to Earth distance is bigger than the planet radius, it's a gravity vector inside planet. Also, I got actually the opposite. Sorry, my mistake. But now you can actually exactly see what is happening here. You don't have to. Explain. Very often, you may laugh at this example right here at the Java doc added to this comment, but probably most of you already found comments like that in your code. They are either auto-generated, but if few of them are generated, then other developers are actually looking at that and figuring out, oh, this is something normal to do. I have actually created comment like that, so this is why I'm bringing it here. Is it useful in any way? It doesn't provide any additional value. Reading the method name is pretty much as robust as reading this comment. It brings no value. And what else? When I read the body of this method, I actually found out that there is one very, very important thing about this method that doesn't just generate an ID. It focuses on generating IDs that are distinct, not only unique, but they are unlike each other. They are very different. They have to differ in at least two different places. So by creating a comment like that, I actually missed the one important information. But even comment like that often means that maybe the name isn't accurate. Maybe it should be just named correctly. And there is no need for the documentation like that. So actually learning about clean code, about self-documenting code, I came to this idea at some point that what would be the cases worth commenting. Probably some of you do that or used to do that before TDD flows small. I actually used to create a skeleton of a method like that. I needed to write a simple function, so first I wanted to figure out what to do, so I just put comments for every operation I have to implement in it. Right? So you can now see the whole flow. It's pretty clear. I have to load all of the entries, accumulate the results, then load the last report. So then I can highlight the differences and build the new report. Pretty cool, right? But what you end up doing often, what I ended up doing, is I filled code doing that in between those comments. And after doing that, I either removed those comments or left only those that I found necessary. But you know what? If function would be written just like that, it would be really readable and very clear to whoever reads it on what is going on. So whenever you have a code comment, actually, maybe it makes a good name. And now you can follow it like, okay, actually, this is loading all of the entries, this row. Then you get the accumulated results. You load the last report. Actually, every single line in this code reflects the comment for the single operation. These commenting steps, that was a great intuition of how the function should be built to be easy to understand. So the more code I written this way, the more I actually started, the more I thought that in the self-documenting world, there is no place for text, for plain text, for documentation, trying to explain code in any way. But clearly I was wrong. And here will be example how. A long time ago, I joined this company that was providing software to support contests. It looked like it was a gallery where jury, when judges were actually using pieces of paper to put down their scores to vote on different works. So what happened is that the organizer wanted to provide the technology to be cooler than that, but there were no smartphones yet. We actually used palm tops. Do you remember palm tops? That was really long ago. So it's pretty much like a smartphone, but it's ridiculous because it was completely offline usually. So if you wanted to synchronize your calendar, you actually had to go back to your home, plug into your computer, and run the synchronization. Sounds pretty absurd today. But we had those palm tops to give the jury. And I found out after joining the company, one of the developers told me, last year we had a problem. The organizer doesn't want to have a login and a password because they don't want to cheat in any way. So they just generated incremental IDs for them. But some of the judges made mistake as they logged in, so they logged in as someone else. So you can figure out how difficult it was to unroll anything like that, and how terrible was the experience for them, because they would have to go all over again with the whole gallery, and the person which scored, they override, voting again. So we wanted to build, to generate IDs that wouldn't be too similar, that it would be actually difficult for them to make such a mistake to hit another ID if they hit a typo. Makes sense, right? So I have built this function. I'm pretty nostalgic about it because it actually contains an obvious bug which caused actually to have 2 or 3 very similar IDs in the production back then, right? But this is actually very short. It's pretty clear what you do here. You actually set up an empty array, and as you go, you just keep on adding new random IDs, but you just have to check whether whether there is something too close already in the array. If not, then you can add it and move on, and, as long until you get enough new ideas. Well, great. Actually, even by looking at this code, you can easily see what is going on right here. You don't have to explain what the code does. The problem is actually whenever your maintainer, your colleague joins this project and they try to read this part of code, they have no idea why. They don't see the whole story you already know about this context. They have no idea that these judges were having issues with login. Why do they have to have IDs like that? And do they need this context? Well, maybe because now they can modify that, they can improve that, they can suggest something more. It would be much easier to generate words, short words from dictionary as logins instead of just numbers for them, right? But you never can change that if you don't understand how is it being used. So a short comment that actually explains not what the function does and what the code does, but why it does what it does is very helpful. And cannot be simply provided by code itself. Right? This is one of the very popular jokes on the internet, the joke comments. So for those, I hope you can see that. So you can if you could just see that the batch size is 300, what does it tell you? Is it a lot? Is it not? If you see a comment like that, although it's pretty funny this way, you can tell one thing about this batch size. It's not natural, it's not normal, it's probably really big, right? So this is what actually that it brings additional value and context that code doesn't explain by itself. Okay, so I've been giving this presentation several times already. And after one of them, I had a phone call from this nice lady from a big corporation, and they had a problem because they had to provide a full documentation for existing project they were working on. And they didn't want to build this documentation, but the business, which is like non-engineers pretty much, or their managers, wanted to have documentation. So they ended up with the consensus they had to build the documentation. And she asked me, well, how can we approach this? How can we build it so that we don't have to constantly maintain that with very high cost? But it already provides value, or it's enough for me. Maybe I could have some tools, ideas to do that. And I asked her, okay, so why do they need that? Right? If you're outside of the context, it's really easy to spot absurds in someone else's project. So the first question I had, like, okay, so why do they want that, right? What do they want to get out of the documentation? And she said, she doesn't know. She honestly doesn't know, right? They just wanted the documentation. And this is what happens very often. If we want to document something, we actually start down by writing what we know, what we want to share, and not with what is important to the other side, what they need to find out or read. So that was actually a big discovery for me to think about how it is going to be used in every single place, right? But before you can figure that out, you have to answer a few questions. First, who is going to use that documentation, right? Whenever you're building an open source project, you usually create this documentation for colleagues that you usually work with. If you're working with junior developers, you're used to providing very basic information and context. If you're working with top developers, you usually forget that a lot of your potential users will be junior or entry level, maybe someone with no programming experience, just right off boot camp, right? So the more questions like that I had, the more I thought like, it sounds a lot like UX designers I'm working with in a company. So if we have similar problems, maybe I could use some of their tools, not to reinvent the wheel. What they do about that, after trying to figure out what kinds of users they have and categorize them, they use a pattern called persona. And persona is just like this stereotypical user, but a very concrete user that represents a whole category, right? So you have to figure out or name a fictional person, but try to be very specific about what skills does this person have, what background, what do they need, right? What do they need to solve? And this is one very popular I see from the document that introduced personas. A really nice document, but UX designers are far better. So fortunately, we don't have to create it as nice. I usually try to put several sentences down about a persona. You can see that's a specific person, a stock photo, no one real. Actually, I would be pretty suspicious. It's a software developer right here, and it says it's more extrovert than introvert. So not everything is right probably with this one. After you have that, then you can go to the second tool. You can figure out what are they trying to accomplish. Why are they visiting your code or documentation in the first place? And the tool for that is the customer journey map or user journey map. This makes you actually write down all of the steps that this person gets from having a need, from the moment they need something to the moment they actually accomplish that. And after you have that, mark the one that brings most frustration. For me, an example would be in Codility. Recently, when I joined, a lot of developers were using Linux machines, and not many run the whole environment on Mac. And if they did, they usually did that on VirtualBox. I didn't want to do that, so I had a lot of pain to set up the whole environment, the real application, on the Mac natively. So after doing that, we've mapped all of the biggest problems, and we couldn't solve all of them and to automate installing all of the system, the dependencies, stuff like that. But we could add some docs and better error messages. So if someone actually tries to run something, we can check for system libraries and tell, like, you probably want to brew install this, and this, just to solve the biggest pain like that, right? Another example is actually something that I do every week, every 2 weeks, maybe a couple of days. I visit GitHub, this small web application from Microsoft. Probably more projects will move to GitLab, so I'll have to visit 2 of them right now. But I'm not visiting a particular repository, but I'm actually looking at the user feed. So I follow a lot of people there, and I'm looking at the repositories they either forked or start. So I don't want to miss an important library or a new cool technology that pops up. I can check this out. But my real need isn't just to learn about the technology. My biggest need actually is to ignore as many of them as I can. So I really want to just jump into the repository, read one sentence, and then be aware, okay, so that's a database written in JavaScript. I can safely ignore that, right? Right now, it's completely out of my core focus. So there are a couple of examples here. What happens? You have this is the first sentence, but a good one from Juice library. So Juice says, to put simply, Juice alleviates the need for factories and the use of new in your Java code. Think of Juice's inject as the new, which is pretty great if you have spent some time using Spring Framework. because you can see that, okay, maybe this is just a simple dependency injector, right? If you know the pattern, but you're coming from a different technology, or you don't know dependency injection at all, it wouldn't tell too much to you. Redux Saga is another one. A project, if you're using Redux, it's very easy for you to understand this part. It's a library that aims to make application side effects easier to manage, more efficient to execute, right? It tells nothing about which technology it is, which programming language, which frameworks. You have no idea whether you can go deeper or not, right? So a persona like that, that's a really bad explanation. Cool. So after sharing this corporate story, I have another one. I used to work on a really old project. It turned 10 when I was working on it, and it was so complicated, and the people who created that initially and then transformed that several times were no longer in the company, or maybe in different departments, and even if someone stayed, didn't even remember what was going on. It had a very, very basic architecture, so it was hard to figure out how it works and what functionalities does it provide. So that was really funny to find that business people were so unsure of how it's supposed to work that they didn't submit bugs. They asked us to investigate how does a certain thing work because they were surprised by the results and they have to understand whether this is actually something they want to have or not. Right? So I was investigating a lot of different things as well, trying to read the code to understand what is going on in the project. And often, actually, I was visiting for a particular object in database, and you end up with something like that, right? This happens in projects. So you can actually, it tells you something. Okay, that was a very special behavior someone added. Instead of adding the whole feature, you could add this special treatment to only 2 particular projects in database, right? So now I can at least respond that, yes, probably this is why. Maybe someone asked that. But when you visit the history, you can see who and when added that. And what 2 different people shared to me, what they do for things like that, is that they use original requests or the stories in commit messages. This one actually could be linking to Jira, but you can easily connect that with any tracker you want to, you're using. So they actually, whenever they have a code they don't understand, they're not trying to document that with the code, but they can track back to the reason, to the original reason for creating that code, which is still pretty cool and doesn't cost too much because you usually work on some ticket. If you're not working on a ticket, but you just want to reorganize maybe a little bit of code or do something technical, you can always add that a fake ticket to cover it. The biggest problem with that, I see, is that whenever you're reorganizing code, refactoring code, like changing indentation or just names, you're now always seeing the refactoring ticket, not the original one. So it's not perfect, but still very, very useful for large and long-lasting projects. Cool. So a couple of smart thoughts. One of them is if documentation is out of date, there should be a test failing. How cool would that be? And I used to work a lot with project called Gradle. You probably all recognize that. But it's the build system on JVM, and I loved the project. I had maybe issues with the API, how it was configured, but basically the whole application was easy to understand, although very complex. And one of the tests I found there to prove how amazing this project is itself, you can see actually a part of test that downloads, as it goes during the build time, it downloads the latest released Gradle from their website, and it executes 3 projects right here, a monolithic Java project, multi-project in Java, and with Kotlin DSL. So it executes a build with the latest released Gradle and the one that you are currently building. So they can compare the build time, one and the other, to tell you whether you have regressed or not. And if your change is slowing down Gradle, then your build will fail. Pretty amazing. So if they have great ideas like that, what do they do about documentation? All over the place, in their documentation, you can see a lot of code snippets. And I always thought that they are very disciplined because I never found typos or out-of-date code snippets. But when you look into the source code, what they actually do, instead of just writing those code snippets in, using this uses ASCII doc format, what they do, they actually link to a file and a snippet inside of that file, so that they can run tests for every single portion of code they are linking to documents. So you can now test your documentation. And how it looks in the file, they're just adding comments to mark this snippet here. And it gives you one extra feature. Whenever you refactor or change a behavior, you have failing tests. You go to fix them, and you can see by snippets in it that it is being used in the documentation. So you might want to go to these documents and update them as well. So it now gives you the other direction. Cool. Another golden thought is writing documentation should be a pleasure. If it's painful to maintain, if it's painful for you to write, probably you're not doing something right. And this might be because we are not taking ownership over documentation. We try to build the best code we can, but documentation is just something extra. We just want to get rid of that task as soon as possible, right? Another example might be documenting HTTP API. Pretty small, but the details are not that important here. This document describes API documentation, HTTP API. So you can generate a simple HTML documentation out of Markdown. That's pretty easy, but it's also strictly formatted so that you can have tools, automated tools around it. That, for instance, can check whether your server code keeps this contract, whether it actually works like that. This one comes from Apiary. I think the most popular tool in this market uses YAML instead of Markdown and is called Swagger. But it shows you basically how easy it might be to write and maintain documentation, also test it as well. Right. So in the end, I wanted to share maybe how I put that in life on my daily basis. So not to look too far away, in my current project in Codility, we use React.js to build frontend. I really enjoy working with the framework, and it encourages you, just like very good object-oriented programming or functional programming, not to create bloated big components on your web pages, but these tiny single-focused components, and reuse them a lot and compose them together instead of extending them and building bigger and bigger components. So what's the real problem? The real problem is actually we found out that we have almost the same component in several places in our code base. Almost the same, slightly different. Why? Because we had no idea that someone already built a component like that. What's worse, a user used to see several different buttons in the whole project because we use different components for that as well. So we wanted to solve that By building a documentation, a project, and this is something that we have written for ourselves, we called it pattern library. So now we have a documentation like that actually describes every single component we have. Then you can put a sentence about what it does and how can you use that. But after, you actually see this component in action and the code that created this usage right here. Another part, so this is actually JavaScript, so you can have that working in browser. There is no magic here. So we now have the code that shows you how to play around with this single component and the component itself right above that. Working interactive component. So whenever you're creating a component and you're thinking like, okay, so this is how you can use it, this is how you can use it, or maybe even in this scenario, now you're putting these examples together, but not to create too much text and to be able to test all of those examples, we're using code to build that in the first place. So this is for single my component right here, maybe some text, but pretty much every example just contains tiny bit of code that will be both displayed and evaluated to show the real component. I hope that we can open source it soon. I think the initial code is already on GitHub. I've put a link, but still remains a lot of work to be usable outside of our code base. But that's it. So a closing thought that I want to share is actually to take ownership over the documentation. If you care about documentation for your project, for your code, as much as you do about the code itself, you will resolve a lot of different problems that you have there. And you will make it work, you will make it testable, you will make it executable, you will make it readable and easy to maintain as well. But in order to cover only what you need, start by thinking who are you creating that for and what needs do you need to satisfy. Few links, mostly for the images I used. The first one right here is the repository in progress. I'll tweet this presentation if you would like to use it. But other than that, I'll be happy to get some questions. Thank you. Any questions? One right there. Right, so just to repeat the question to everyone, the question is how to create the documentation for architecture, for example, in microservices world to be able to present how this communication is working. So my answer is actually I brought to you mostly things that I have failed for several times, and I learned how to do that. This is one of the things that I haven't yet learned how to do properly, although I have tried multiple times. Usually, I end up with one of two things. Either I generate this documentation to flow, and then no one wants to read it because it's pretty much a mess. The other one is I create that by hand, and it looks really nice, and it explains a lot of things, but no one maintains it. So it actually runs out of date pretty fast. One thing I tried to generate, I actually used a plugin for microservices to discover patterns, how they are communicating, and created Swagger files out of it to be able to present what the real API is to document that. I wanted maybe someday to extend that to be able to present actually the flows of the communication for different scenarios. I've never accomplished that. I've never seen a good project that could be both connected to our code and readable. Sorry. If you find it, I hope you can reach out to me and tell me what it is. Okay, thank you so much.